We are ready to start this first webinar in a series of webinars organized by the Global Center for Climate Mobility as part of our new Climate Mobility Academy. We're very pleased to welcome you to this event on immobility in the Greater Caribbean. This event is being recorded for your awareness, and it is held in both English and Spanish. So you can, at the bottom of your taskbar in Zoom, pick a different language under the interpretation button if you want to listen to this webinar in Spanish or English, respectively. And I'm inviting all the speakers to speak a little bit slower maybe than usual for the interpretation. It's my pleasure to co-host this webinar with our colleagues at the Association of Caribbean States. We are joined this morning by Ms. Jimena Cuevas Portillo, who is the Director for Disaster Risk Reduction, Sustainable Tourism, Caribbean Sea, and the Environment at the ACS, and who will be welcoming us in a moment. And Jimena, we're very pleased that you could make it. We're very grateful to the ACS for the continued partnership. And this webinar builds on a joint effort we have been leading with the Association of Caribbean States, focused on climate mobility dynamics in the Greater Caribbean region. The Greater Caribbean includes all the countries around the shared resource of the Caribbean Sea. And those countries are connected not just by shared natural resources and cultural connections, but also by a shared climate threat with rising impacts already across the region, leading both to negative impacts on people's health and livelihoods and to their connection to home. So we've seen in the past years dramatic impacts from more severe hurricanes displacing people within the region, but also from their countries and to other countries across the region and further afield. And we see more difficult decision having to be made as countries and especially small islands in the region make choices on where to rebuild, how to rebuild, where the future should lie for their people when it comes to both the locations that people are settling in, but also the livelihoods that they're pursuing. Today's webinar is focused on the people in this context who aren't either willing or able to move. It builds on findings from our Greater Caribbean Climate Mobility Initiative, again, a joint effort with the ACS, also bringing together several UN partners, the UNDP, UNDRR, the UNFCCC and IOM, as well as the World Bank, to jointly look at what are some of the projections for the region when it comes to movement and what are current realities. And one key finding is that most people do not want to move. They're very much attached to their land, to their homes, to their communities. And so protecting their right to stay is really the first order of priority for people and should be for governments across the region. At the same time, we also have findings about people who might want to move but feel unable to. And this is what is often called in the literature trapped populations. So we want to today explore both those people who want to stay home and how they can be supported, as well as the communities that would like to move but are unable to without support. Who are they and what options, what measures are available in the region to support their priorities? Without further ado, I would like to introduce my colleague Jimena Cuevas Portilla again to deliver the welcoming remarks to this webinar on behalf of the Association of Caribbean States. Jimena, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tara, for this introduction. Good morning, everyone. It is truly an honor to be here today and to have been invited to deliver remarks at this important webinar on climate mobility, immobility in the Greater Caribbean. On behalf of the Association of Caribbean States, I warmly welcome all participants, distinguished panelists, and colleagues joining us virtually from across the region and beyond. I also wish to express my sincere gratitude to the Global Center for Climate Mobility for organizing this event and for its continued leadership in promoting climate justice and implementing adaptive solutions for communities on the front lines of the climate crisis. The Greater Caribbean region is experiencing more frequent and intense natural hazards, along with rising temperatures and sea levels. These changes threaten our ecosystems and livelihoods, leading to significant environmental, social, and economic impacts. One of the most present issues for the region, composed of many low-lying islands, is rising sea levels. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, sea levels could rise up to 1 meter by the end of this century. The Honorable Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, stated during a powerful speech at the World Leaders Summit on the second day of the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference in Glasgow that a 2 degrees Celsius rise in global temperature would be a death sentence for island and coastal communities. The impacts of climate change can lead to climate-induced mobility. And for millions of people worldwide, climate displacement is already a reality. In some cases, mobility has served to alleviate the effects of prolonged droughts in Central America. However, mobility is not always an option for all populations and communities vulnerable to climate impacts. While migration often receives attention, today we focus on those who cannot move, the immobile populations. It is important to highlight that, in the absence of long-term climate adaptation measures, people face a greater risk of becoming trapped in unsafe areas when climate impacts erode the ecosystems on which their livelihoods depend. The recent IPCC report underscores that some people would be unable or unwilling to move from places where they remain vulnerable to climate impacts. Climate immobility is an area that is often overlooked and inadequately addressed in climate policies and disaster planning. Addressing both voluntary and involuntary immobility within climate action strategies can significantly reduce risk. Understanding immobility in the context of climate change is therefore essential to support the development of equitable and effective adaptation strategies, as well as the resilience of people and communities who remain in risk-prone areas. Today's webinar provides a crucial platform to raise awareness of trends, risks, and responses related to climate mobility through data-driven insights, shared experiences, and the identification of strategies to strengthen the resilience of communities that remain in place. Before proceeding, I would like to take a moment to recognize and thank the many individuals and organizations that have made this webinar possible. First, my sincere appreciation to the Global Center for Climate Mobility for convening this important discussion and for its ongoing leadership in advancing climate justice and supporting frontline communities around the world. I would also like to acknowledge the panelists and speakers joining us today, bringing their invaluable expertise. Your insights will be instrumental in enriching this dialogue. Finally, I extend my gratitude to all participants and stakeholders who have taken the time to join us from across the Greater Caribbean region and beyond. Your participation ensures that our collective efforts to address climate and mobility are informed, inclusive, and effective. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Director Cuevas. Thank you for highlighting the stakes in the region linked to climate change, especially the effects of sea level rise, but also more extreme temperatures, droughts, flooding. We would like to share with you some of the key findings from our research, the GCCMI, and I call upon my colleague Emma Winkley, who's a knowledge associate with the Global Center for Climate Mobility, to give a presentation of some of the key insights from the Greater Caribbean Climate Mobility Report. It's called Great Caribbean Shifts and will be officially launched at our Climate Mobility Summit later this month in New York during the UN General Assembly. So we look forward to soon share that report with all of you. But you're getting a sneak preview today, and I pass the floor to my colleague Emma to highlight some of the key findings from the work. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and to Jimena for both of your generous introductions and for framing the topic at hand today. Just checking that everyone can hear me and see my screen okay. Okay, great. I will get started then. As Sarah mentioned, this presentation will cover some of the key findings of the research carried out by the Greater Caribbean Climate Mobility Initiative throughout 2023 and 2024 through our partnership with the Association of Caribbean States. It will combine fieldwork and modeling projections to paint a picture of some current realities in the communities that we surveyed, as well as potential futures on climate immobility in the Greater Caribbean region, in combination to underpin key recommendations for policy action around climate immobility. Before I dive into the results, I wanted to start with a conceptual framing of how we understand climate immobility. Sarah gave a great introduction of this concept, but just to put things in a bit more specifics, we understand immobility to occur across a spectrum of forced to voluntary, involving different constraints, vulnerability, and agency. As today's results will demonstrate, and as Sarah already highlighted, the Greater Caribbean region is marked by a high degree of place attachment, as in many other world regions where people largely want to stay home, even in the face of growing climate risk and uncertainty. And however, just because people want to stay home, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are more resilient where they are. And as will be demonstrated by this presentation, as people choose to stay or refuse to leave, they may continue to face severe climate impacts in the places that they stay in, illuminating key questions for policymakers determining how best to protect people who do not view mobility as an option in the face of the climate crisis. So for visual learners on the call, I included this excellent diagram of this concept by the Mixed Migration Center, who was GCCM's field research partner in Africa. As MMC and others actually correctly point out, this diagram is a bit of a simplification of this concept of both the way that climate impacts decisions and outcomes of mobility and immobility. However, I do think it's a solid foundation for situating the way in which climate change affects aspirations and capacities to move and not to move, and the way in which the aspirations and capabilities framework is underpinned and shaped by existing in-place adaptation strategies. So with that conceptual foundation, I'll move on to talking through some of the key takeaways of the Great Caribbean Shifts report, which is now available on our digital platform and documents this research extensively. Today's focus will be on immobility, but this report also discusses mobility and forced displacement. So if you have further questions or would like to learn more, I highly recommend you read through the report as well as the case studies of individual countries where we carried out fieldwork. So the field research was carried out in 14 communities across 6 countries in the region, including 6 mainland countries and 6 Caribbean island countries. In each country, we tried to find a diverse profile of field sites, including rural, urban, and coastal areas, as well as places of origin and destination, in order to get perspectives from people that are considering moving, those that have already moved, and those that are staying in place, as of course is the focus of today's conversation. This approach was intended to guide the generation of specific case studies, and while several of the results that I will present lend themselves to support broader regional trends, most of the results cannot be decontextualized because of the way in which they are deeply embedded within local dynamics in each field site. So what is true for one field site it goes without saying that what is true for one field site in each country may not be true for others. And the results that I will show on the following slides are largely a culmination of the total or aggregate survey responses from each of these countries at the country level. So what are the current immobility realities in the Greater Caribbean region in the sampled countries? It goes without saying that climate change is an everyday experience for many across the region. 75% of our survey respondents indicate that they see climate impacts in their daily lives, with negative mental and physical health effects being the top reported impacts. Despite this accumulating loss and damage in its various forms, and these potentially very dire and difficult circumstances posed by the climate crisis for many, 56% of respondents indicate that they have no desire or plans to move. And this is supportive of the wide sweeping attachment to place that both appeared in our survey results as well as in focus group discussions. So this 56% correlates to the yellow-green color on the bar chart on the right. And we found that it was most prevalent in Costa Rica, where the majority of respondents listed that they have no desire or plans to move, in contrast to Colombia, which had the lowest amount of respondents indicating that they have no desire or plans to move. We also were able to conduct regression analyses of these results in order to pinpoint specific demographic variables that could be correlated to some of these preferences, with being over 35, having no or only primary education, and being born in the sampled location, meaning having no previous migration or movement experience, associated with no desire to move. I will show on this slide a brief example of some of the regression analyses results. You'll see, as I mentioned, we have found a strong correlation between preference to stay and age, where all sampled countries show a fairly steep regression line, meaning higher correlation between preference to stay and older age. You'll see that the lines trend upwards as age increases. We also looked at preference to stay based on financial situation, trying to understand how financial status is correlated with capacity and desire to move. And we found this correlation to be strongest in several countries, including Colombia, the Bahamas, Antigua and Barbuda, and Jamaica. However, while many people across the region might choose not to leave, others had less agency in their decisions to stay. Those that are considering moving but feel unable to correlate to this turquoise or light blue color in the bar chart on the right. Climate stress combined with social, economic, and political pressures can coerce people to stay just as it coerces others to move. We were again able to pinpoint some demographic traits correlated with these preferences, finding that that gender played quite a significant role, finding that women were 10% more likely than men to respond that they wanted to move but felt unable to move. We also found that through, again, a regression analysis, that participants with previous migration experience correlated to having a desire to move but feeling unable to in 3 countries, including Colombia, Costa Rica, and Jamaica. I want to point out the bit of an outlier that is Colombia, because I think it's important to note that the survey sample in Colombia actually had the highest proportion of migrant respondents or people with previous migration experience, which we think could be related to the potential high proportion of respondents listing that they are considering moving but feel unable to, linking past migration experience with potentially less capacity to move in the future. Okay, I wanted to, before I move on to the results from the projections of our climate mobility model, talk through some of the ways that people are navigating these decisions for themselves, in addition to the individual and group characteristics that we found associated with immobility that I just previously presented. So the way that research participants themselves perceive and navigate their options is deeply impacts their ways and how they choose to stay or leave. Focus group discussions revealed several sociocultural factors that shape people's aspirations and capacities. Perceptions of mobility and immobility are strongly shaped by cultural notions of home and what it means to leave home. 2 quotes that I have selected from Costa Rica and Barbuda demonstrate how mobility and immobility decisions in the context of climate change are perceived against broader embedded mobility dynamics. For the participant in Costa Rica, mobility in the context of climate change is viewed quite pragmatically, and this is potentially shaped by the pragmatic outlook on mobility by participants in the survey sample who are living in the coffee region of Costa Rica, where temporary, circular, and seasonal mobility have been common coping strategies for many decades. Similarly, in Barbuda, participants demonstrated navigating their current decisions in the face of the climate crisis against this backdrop of long-held strategies of emigration, pointing out how the difference between how they view moving abroad is actually quite influenced by the relationship to home. So this participant explains how for them, emigration is a means to preserve home, where migration is a result of the climate-related loss of home. The relationship between home was echoed well throughout the region, is also showcased in this quote by the participant from the Bahamas, who noted that their grandfather's reluctance to leave during Hurricane Dorian was shaped by Bahamians' cultural connections to their home. And for many, home is beyond just a house. It encompasses the economic, cultural, and spiritual ties to place. For many, it is ancestral and generational bonds and claims to land, as noted in this quote by the participant from Barbuda. Across the Greater Caribbean, where land access and ownership has historically and is currently an equity and justice issue, maintaining land connections are often critical to generational transfers of wealth, self-determination, and cultural continuity. Among our research sample, this was particularly true from respondents from Barbuda and the Wayana indigenous peoples of Suriname. Lastly, I think I wanted to point out before I move into the modeling projections that even when people decide to stay in place, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are resilient where they are. I think this is showcased quite well by a participant who was forcibly displaced when extreme rainfall flooded her entire town and made it so that the entire town was displaced. The participant noted that where they moved to in Soledad, or I think it was in Barranquilla, they had to save up in order to return home, but their attachment to home was so strong that they felt that suffering at home was better than suffering in the place that they had been displaced to. They wrote, or they said, "It's better to die here from hunger than to die anywhere else." This photo on the right is a stark photo from our documentary in Jamaica, which shows how lives and practices and religious practices and cultural practices continue even in the aftermath of disasters, despite impact and low resilience to future events. Okay, so pairing these current realities with projections of future scenarios, our climate mobility model looks at the ways in which climate change might impact the global economy across two different timeframes, including 2030 and 2050, and how these impacts to the economy might impact population shifts and where people choose to move or choose not to move, which of course is the focus of today's conversation. So just quickly, I will note that this is how the model looks at economic impacts. It considers variables related to production, consumption, labor markets, and international trade to project where people will move based on available economic opportunities. It looks at different climate scenarios as generated by the IPCC. And on the following slides, I will look at the middle road scenario, which is considered the business as usual scenario, as well as the rocky road scenario, which is considered the most pessimistic. The model also gives us demographic categories of movers and stayers. So it provides available information based on age, gender, and education of immobile populations. So what does our model say about immobility in the Greater Caribbean? So first, it tells us a bit about the economy. It shows that by 2050, average losses, again, taking losses across all of the countries in the Greater Caribbean in the model, could range between 13 and 20% of GDP per capita by 2050. However, losses will not be evenly distributed. Low-lying areas and those affected by temperature extremes are likely to be the most impacted. You'll see that on the map on the right, which shows the distribution of GDP impacts, pixels that are the darkest pink red color are those areas that will experience the most damage under the most pessimistic scenario, which is the rocky road scenario by 2050. So as these economic opportunities change, it will shift where people move to or don't move to across the region. Because nowhere will be free from climate impacts, the model projects that some people who would have moved in a world without climate change will actually be deterred from moving in a world with climate change. Because of the way that climate will impact their potential destinations. So instead of moving to a nearby city to escape the impacts at home in the rural community, people might be deterred from moving because of those impacts to that city, as an example. By 2050, between 5 and 6 million people could be rendered immobile or deterred from moving across the region, depending on the scenario. But even still, those that stay in place could face deepening poverty because their lack of movement or immobility is impacted by impacts to their destination. It doesn't necessarily mean that they won't continue to face climate impacts in the origin. Those that stay could face higher poverty. The model shows that between 2 and 2.5 million additional adults could be pushed into poverty. Sorry. I'm so sorry. By climate change alone, up to 2050. Here is just a great overview of the spatial distribution of immobility. It's a bit hard to tell, but you'll see that concentrations shift depending on the scenario. You'll see that, for example, which is as one of the biggest countries, so it's a bit more noticeable, Mexico has a bit higher concentrations of immobility under the middle road scenario, where Northern South America, including countries such as Colombia and Venezuela, have higher concentrations under the rocky road scenario. Finally, though the model gives us indication of the demographics of the population of immobility, of people that are immobile. We find that overall, their gender is an influence on immobility. 190,000 more women than men will be immobilized across the region under the Rocky Road scenario by 2050. On this map, you can see the total number of women that are immobilized compared to men as a percentage of the total population, which shows hotspots of female immobility. Again, the darkest pixels, close to 100%, are where female immobility will be greatest, meaning that more women will be immobilized compared to men as a percentage of the total immobile population. This bar chart on the right here is a bit of a different number, so please be aware that it's showing these two things, or these maps and this bar chart are showing different data, but this shows the proportion of women that are immobile compared to the total female population compared to the proportion of men that are immobile out of the total male population. We find that the immobility of women compared to men as a percent of the female population is greatest, happens in 18 out of the 25 member states to the ACS. And is greatest in countries such as Barbuda and Haiti. Without proper support, women risk being left behind in other ways if their adaptation is not supported in place. What do all of these things say for policy? So when we combine these insights, we find that people need options in the face of the climate crisis. Strong preferences to stay and remain in place mean that the right to stay must be protected through measures that facilitate adaptation and build resilience. However, this does not mean that there is no role for mobility, particularly because people in the region might view mobility positively when it is temporary and enables life improvements. This supports calls for the deeper integration of mobility into development and climate adaptation agendas. Finally, people that want to move must be able to. Populations at risk of becoming involuntarily immobile must be targeted for social protections and resources, relocation support, and safe and dignified mobility pathways. The same should be true for populations that are involuntarily displaced or forced to move out of harm's way. To that end, the GCCMI proposes 6 key actions for policymakers across the region to address the spectrum of voluntary to involuntary mobility and immobility. Each of the 6 actions aims at improving resilience and adaptation options for different populations, those that stay, those that moved, and those that are displaced. I will not dive into the specifics of each of these, of the 7 actions, but I do encourage you to view the sub actions more in depth on our digital platform that might inspire ways in which you can promote action in your own communities. I will leave it there, and I am happy to answer any questions, either in the Q&A or in the chat. I thank you all for your attention and time, and I pass it back to Sarah.
Thanks, Emma. Thank you for the comprehensive overview, showcasing both, again, the deep desire for people to stay in their communities, stay in their homes, but also the risks that that may carry for some groups, especially older people, we heard, women, communities that may sink deeper into poverty, which I think affects mainly rural areas. But we also, I think, seen from our data that people who have already moved and may already maybe have done the move from rural areas into urban neighborhoods then are often in a less favorable position to keep moving if they still face climate risks. So there's differences between groups that also require differences in policy approach and response. And we're very pleased to discuss some of those nuances with our next guest, who joins us not from St. Kitts and Nevis, but represents St. Kitts and Nevis, one of our government partners in starting to dig deeper into these regional findings through country deep dives. Country deep dives take a similar approach to the regional initiatives in that they start with data and evidence, consult with stakeholders, communities, governments, institutional actors to develop blueprints for action. And we have just completed this exercise in St. Kitts and Nevis in collaboration with the Ministry of Environment, Climate Action, and Constituency Empowerment. And we're very pleased to have Dr. Elric Francis, who's the director of the Climate Action Unit in the ministry, join us today to talk a little bit about some of the insights and findings from St. Kitts and Nevis, which communities, which parts of the islands are particularly impacted by this phenomenon of immobility, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, and how does he see the options for the government to respond to this. So I'm asking Dr. Elric to maybe open his camera if he can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, super. And I'll pass the floor to you to maybe start with a description of the realities as you see them in St. Kitts and Nevis.
All right, good day, colleagues, partners, and friends. Let me begin by thanking the Global Center for Climate Mobility for convening this session and this webinar. And I also want to acknowledge the Association of Caribbean States. I want to acknowledge our moderator, Sarah Rosengartner, our keynote speaker, Miss Emma Winkley, and hopefully my fellow panelists, Miss Laura Musker. Now, it's a privilege to share how St. Kitts and Nevis is advancing in the conversation about climate mobility. The Greater Caribbean Shifts analysis projects that nearly 6 million people in our region could be trapped in place by 2050. In light of this, the most affected are the women, youth, and marginalized communities. In our country, for example, the most affected are the elderly, the youth, and we have the non-English speaking immigrant communities. The major priorities that we have, that we, the government, have, is to have some informed settlement and spatial planning. So we have, I can say, informal settlements where people are in areas where it is not ideal to live. And so they put themselves at great risk of climate adversities. For example, we have a gut called Wash Gut in the Caribbean area, where we have 3 families with young children who, during the past hurricane, they had to call the government in order to get somebody to move them out of that area. Then, of course, we have other instances where people who are living in guts, where we have a disabled gentleman whose elderly mother used to carry him on her back up the gut to for him to get to work. And the situation that we have in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis is that in both of these situations, neither of the individuals want to move. The squatters, they don't want to move because they are not sure if they're going to get housing, because the government does not have a policy of giving housing to non, you know, let me say illegal people. Let me not say illegal people. Let me say non-authorized individuals. And then in the case with the person with disability, they don't want to move because for them that is their childhood home. They have been living there for decades, and so they have a lot of links and connections to that property. And so that is the situation. That is 2 of the situations that we are facing in St. Kitts and Nevis.
Thank you, Dr. Francis, for sharing those realities and really giving a very concrete example of what that looks like on the islands and the challenges in engaging with people and finding solutions for people that are either, as you mentioned, like in an informal situation, both in terms of housing, but also maybe their immigration status. And so how to address that through a formal government response, but also, again, like dealing with people who have deep attachments to a place. And even if their risk is there, they may not give it the same weight or hedge their bets, let's say, that things will turn out okay. Can you share maybe some of the approaches that you have taken or some of the collaborations that you have thought out to address this challenge, and maybe also past experience that you may have had with being able to move people and how that has turned out? Like, what have been more successful examples of supporting people who were willing to move away from risk situations?
Okay, so in our context, we have some success in relocating people. For example, in the Old Road area, we have people who are living very close to the ocean. The ocean is basically their backyard. And so during storms, they deal with that significant wave action. And so what the government did when they will open up lands for project development, those people were given priority. And so we were able to shift, should say, about half a dozen households. And so with those half a dozen households, based on the population of the households, that's almost 20 people that we were able to move out of those climate adverse situations. However, we did have a situation where an individual actually returned because their house wasn't as affected by the storm, and they unfortunately returned, and the government was put in a situation where we either have to revoke the house that the government gave them, or it was debated if we should demolish and ban, create a red zone for those houses in those areas. In the end, I think we allowed them to stay, but then we said that if a situation were to arise, they would not be able to get the same situation that they receive. So if something happens to their house, the government would not assist them. And so they signed that agreement, and that's how we dealt with that.
Thank you again for sharing this. And I think it points, both your answers have really pointed to the importance of housing and land as one factor of enabling people to move away from risk. But also then this question of what happens actually to the areas that are to be vacated. Are they turned into, let's say, re-natured zones, or if properties remain there, is it a magnet, let's say, for people to return, or also for new people to move in potentially? So the question of like what happens to vacated land or housing is coming forward as important. And I wonder if there are kind of more factors around social ties, social relations. Have you found that, tapping into people's social networks can be either a hindering factor or can be a facilitating factor when it comes to people moving? And maybe in that context also, how is the situation different for natives versus people who have migrated to St. Kitts and Nevis?
Right. And so in that is very apt, because one of the situations we actually face is when we were opening lands for people to move into the area, a lot of them did not want to move outside of their village. For example, the area of Old Road, we had open lands in Upper Sandy Point area. That is two completely different villages, and a lot of them were reluctant to leave their communities behind. And so what we try to do, get we try to stick them as close together as possible. For example, two of the houses that were being moved, two of the households that were being moved were how do we say, close family members. So when we try to move them, we try to put them in plots right next to each other. That way they don't feel that they are losing that sense of community. And so that is actually an issue that we deal with. Matter of fact, even now, when plots are being opened up, a lot of people, they want to have land in their community. And this is not just the ones who are in climate vulnerable situations. These are people, let's say, someone who they just started working and now they say they want to go out on their own and have their own house. They ideally they want a piece of land right next to their family. And so that is situations that we, the government, have to deal with.
Maybe last question before we bring in Laura also into the conversation, our second panelist. And I want to, make a quick note for our listeners that you will have also a chance to ask questions and come in. So be ready for that. And I saw some questions and comments also in the chat. But I would like to hear from you, Dr. Francis, where you see kind of the best entry points for addressing some of these questions of, either supporting people to stay in the locations, even if they're risk exposed. So what measures could actually help reduce that risk and enable people to stay? But also when it comes to this question of moving people away from risk, do you see the main bottlenecks with data? Do you think there's a different policy response needed? Is it a question of better community engagement and really outreach, incentives that communities might need? what would be your, and maybe it's a mix of those, but what would be your recommendations for next steps?
Well, it definitely is a risk for all these, is a mix of all these. What we need to do, we need to update our hazard maps. We have hazard maps, we have flood hazard maps, hurricane hazard maps, earthquake hazard maps, volcanic risk hazard maps. But unfortunately, many of them are outdated. The only ones that have been recently updated the tsunami hazard maps. And so if we were able to update these maps, we would be able to actually go out to the residents of these areas and inform them of the risks that they face living in these areas. Another thing that we are currently undergoing is an update to our building code. I think it's going to be a Caribbean-wide building code. So it should, based on the new building code, houses should be able to withstand more catastrophic hazards. I think the new one is up to a category 5 hurricane. They should be able to, the way that it's built, they should be able to reduce flooding. There should be some place in the structure that would reduce damage from tremors, etc. And so that update to the building code is underway. However, we are talking about mitigation and adaptation. So now the existing houses, they would have to now be retrofitted, and that will come at a cost. And now the question is, who will bear this cost? Will it be the residents, or will it be the government, or will we have to seek external funding to have a retrofitting project? And so these are some of the issues that we are currently facing and we are currently trying to fix. So updating, getting more data, updating the hazard maps. And so with the hazard maps, we have the volunteers going out and to educate the residents of their situation, and so that I could understand. And so now when we were to come along and they say, okay, you guys, you are living in this area is at risk of these hazards, we want you to retrofit it to withstand these hazards. And then the people would have an idea, okay, this is my risk and this is the mitigation. Is it worth it? And we want to have the pendulum swing to them being upgrading, retrofitting their residents.
Thank you. Thanks. That's a great and very concrete recommendation for action. I would like to invite Laura Cerner now to join us. Laura is one of our GCCM Youth Fellows this year. She's also a lawyer and very much focused on climate adaptation in her native Colombia. And Laura joins us to share some experiences from risk reduction in urban areas. And I can't see you, Laura, but I think you're with us. Oh yeah, here you are. Sorry, my screen was not showing you. I would love to invite you to share some key lessons from your work on urban adaptation, and especially how equity considerations can be integrated in urban adaptation, so that communities that, again, maybe do not want to move have the option to remain in place. So over to you, Laura, for your introductory remarks.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm gonna share my screen. Please let me know if you can see it.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I will try to present a Colombian case specifically and answer the question that Sarah mentioned around this case. This is the case of San Andres, Providencia, and Santa Catalina, that is an island in Colombia. The context is that this is an Caribbean archipelago in Colombia, is one of the most vulnerable departments in our country. The population is a mix between racial people, that is a community, an ethnical community in our country, African American communities, also indigenous community. And in 2020, the Hurricane Utah Category 5 destroyed all the islands. San Andres, Providencia, and Santa Catalina are connected, but are different places. But under this name, we consider this as a one department from Colombia. San Andres was almost Providencia, sorry, was almost destroyed in 98% of all the infrastructure around the island. And San Andres, that is the capital of the department, also was suffering so much damage. People were affected because of these hurricanes. And also Santa Catalina was very affected for the causes of the hurricanes. What was the response on the legal action for the community in that case? And many of the result communities choose to stay in the place, and this is the first point of my presentation. And is in this case, even if the department is a very vulnerable place, the connection with the lands and the connection with the communities and the process that they already have is very important. And because of that, most of the community stay in the place, even if they know that this is a very dangerous place under this emergency. And also this is very important because, as I mentioned, it's an island. So the only way to go out to this island and to communicate or to be in another place in Colombia is taking an airplane. And we know that this is also an expensive way to move for most of the community, especially if they are vulnerable communities. So the community started working in a legal actions in order to receive help from the main state. And this is one of the first point of this case, and in general of the Colombian situation, is that most of the community, when they are in the middle of this action, they present legal actions. And one of the most common is an tutela actions that pretend to protect the fundamental rights. In that case, the community present this action under the Constitutional Court, that is the most highly constitutional for Colombian people. And under these actions, they present to protect or to pretend that the Colombian state protect their rights to have a dignified life, housing, priority consultation, and also ancestral property. And I want to make a very special point in this priority consultation because this is one of the main points of this case. And it's important that the community be part of the process of rebuilding the islands. Colombia created plans to rebuilding the island, but the Constitutional Court in the ruling understand that this process didn't include the vision of the community and didn't include all the connection and then central property that this community has. So after this, one of the main lessons that we learn as a Colombian, but also that can be shared in the whole regions, the first one is the disaster risk management. Colombia already have a very strong system to manage the disaster. We already integrate in our law, in an assistant political norms around climate change, how to respond to risks. But in the practice, when we are trying to put that to respond to emergencies, we have a challenge, we have a gap between what we already have in the law and what is the practice. And this challenge is around so many things, for example, economic, political issues, but also the disconnection between some institutionals at the national, and also at the local level. So one of the first lessons that we learn is that we need to connect what we already have in our legal system with the practice that we are doing in the local level. The second point is the community engagement and empowerment. As I mentioned before, San Andres, Providencia, and Santa Catalina are a special place when the racial people in Colombia are very connected with the land and has already a very strong culture, and they know how to adapt and how to respond to the emergency from their own knowledge. And when we recognize this knowledge and when we learn from the communities, when we try to put the practice that they already know, you need it with what we already have in the law. This is what makes the plan successful. But when we are trying to put the law system for one line and the disaster managed from the other one, and the knowledge from the community from the other one, we have this gap that most of the solutions that we present from the national level are not going to be connected what the local level are expecting for. So what we learn is that it's very important to receive, but also to communicate and to articulate the solutions around the knowledge and the power of the community. The second point is how to the right to stay and to move in dignity. And this is very important because all these rights have to be central in the justice base and climate justice base. That means that we can ensure safe conditions, access to the basic service, participation, and sustainable livelihoods for these who are remaining in the islands. As I mentioned, especially in Providencia, that is a small island, they decided to stay. Almost all the community decided to stay, and even 4 years, 5 years after this hurricane, they are still working to rebuild the island. The second point is how we can guarantee that the people that want to move can move, but even they have access still to the human rights bases, but also they can still have very connection with the lands. And this came with one of the main important points is that because this is an island and is not very close to the rest of the Department of Colombia, we need to guarantee how this process can be connected with the other department. I mean, try to put the departments not as an island in the country and try to work the around these rights together. The last one is how we can guarantee that even if we want to maintain the community in the same time, in the same place, with the same guarantees, when they want to come back, they can come back. And this is a challenge also very related with economical and the labor situation, especially for young people, that they, even if they want to come back, they don't have the capacity to stay in that place because they don't have academic opportunities or professional opportunities to stay there. So the recommendations and the opportunity to how to manage this climate immobility, especially in Colombia, but in general for the region, the first one is to difference the forms of mobility. In the case of Colombia, the Constitutional Court, after this decision, make another decision around the importance that the state recognize climate mobility as a different kind of displacement. In Colombia, for our context of violence, we already recognize displacement. So we already have a legislation around displacement, but we don't have the recognition around climate displacement. And of course, we don't have the recognition for the different types of climate mobility. So under this rule, the court recognized that the states need to understand what are the kinds of mobility in our country and how this mobility can be addressed for the policy makers, but also in the legal system. The second point is the central local community, and this is very important because Colombia is a very diversified place, and of course, most of the more vulnerable people are also indigenous community, Afro-descendants community, racial community, young people, and this is important because they already have the knowledge to respond to this crisis, but this knowledge can be ignored in the process to adapt to climate crisis. So it's very important to how to manage this community agency in order to create decisions and plans around also what the community wants for themselves. The other one is the data and the knowledge. We already have a system in Colombia around climate disaster, but even if we have this system in order to respond to emergency, we still have a very big gap in the data around how to understand, for example, how many people were affected very quickly in order to respond very quickly to the emergency. We still are in the phase to respond only, but not to prevent the event, and also not to prevent how to respond in case of emergency. And for this, we need more data, and we need to develop different systems to receive this data. We know that for sure, because of internet challenge and all the telecommunication issues that we can have in some part of the country, is very challenged to receive this data. But the idea and the recommendation around that is try to create a new ways, also using the participation of the community to put this data. this is, for example, in Medellin, that is another city in Colombia, there are communities that create their own system to receive and to keep this data. So when the emergency came, they already know who was in the neighborhood, who was in a house, who was in the park, and all this information put it closer or put it together with the state information can be very helpful to respond to emergency. The second part, and this is a very general recommendation, is also to use the international rulings to adapt the national police, but also the legal system that we have. The Inter-American Court that in the couple 2 months ago already recognized the climate immobility for the regions and make a lot of recommendations for the states in order to recognize the right to state, the right to participate in the decision that the community the community have to be part, but also recognize how the state had to prevent the first displacement on in case that the community don't want to stay, the right to stay in dignity. So these international rulings can be very helpful in order to put that in the national, but also in the local way. My last point is how young can be contributed to this point. And I think that the first point is on mobility and adaptation. And this point is very important because when we open the space to participation to young people, we can also listen what are the needs that young people have in this order. The first one, and from the experience in Colombia, one of the main points is that if the young people have to stay in that place that are very vulnerable, they doesn't have the opportunity to have access to education, for example, to go to universities in the other parts of the country, but also they have this lack around how can I improve my labor life? Because of course, these places have so many economical challenges after the emergencies as the hurricane. So one of the main points is how we can open the space of participation to young people so we can listen what are the challenges that they have in order also to stay in the place, but what's mean for them to leave the countries or the departments. The other one is co-design adaptation and relocation strategies. I think that this is very important because one of the most challenge for the community, for the young people, is how to share what they are doing in their community with the national level. So we know that already so many organizations needed for young people are working in adaptation solutions in these kind of places. So it's very important to connect this idea with what we already have in the legal or in the policy system. The other one is try to amplify the voices and try to close the gap that we have between local communities and also young communities. And the other one is mobilizing campaigns and digital exchange and resilience and inclusion. And this point, for example, is very important, the role that GCCM have been doing with the fellows, because we already have the opportunity to work with young people in our country on even just the idea of share this information that allows them to create a new ways to respond to the crisis and also to share this information in their own community. So I will wait for that. Thank you so much for listening to me. And if you have any question, I will be here.
Thank you, Lara. That was excellent and great for highlighting. Well, on the one hand, I'll start from the back, the really recognition by the Inter-American Court for Human Rights that states actually under their existing human rights obligations should already be doing quite a lot of the things that we talked about here today, which is protecting people's right to stay, making sure they have access to climate risk information, making sure that people who are moving can do so in a dignified manner, that there are provisions in place both for internally displaced people, but also those who cross borders. So it's quite an important ruling, as you pointed out, both for national level advocacy and also for regional engagement, further regional engagement. Secondly, you also really highlighted that there's often a big gap between these kind of on the paper obligations and policies and laws, and then the realities on the ground. And I very much liked how you highlighted opportunities for engaging communities in building resilience, in collecting data on risk exposure. I think in Africa, the slum dwellers movement has really used information gathering about their communities as a leverage to engage with governments and to say, we have data about our communities, let's work together. So there's definitely room there, I think, for learning across contexts and applying some of those practices, making sure that communities track hazards and feed into disaster risk response systems. But I don't want to speak more. I would like to open for discussion. We're a bit over time because we started late. We had some questions already in the chat about our presentation, and I'll pick up a couple of them. There are questions related to how do we isolate climate factors in people's decisions to move, like when is something climate mobility versus, driven by, let's say, economic risks or family motivations. Like how do we distinguish those mixed motivations that people have, and where do we draw the line? And then also, is there already evidence on effective disaster response systems that we have looked at? And I think there are a few questions relating to young people, and how do we account for climate as a factor in young people's movement in particular? So maybe I ask Laura and Dr. Francis and Emma to pick some of the questions, and I'll also invite the colleagues who are on the call, if you have more questions, to raise your hand or put them in the chat, and we'll try to address as many. But who would like to speak to this first round of questions? A, how do we distinguish what is climate mobility versus other forms of mobility? And B, do we see already examples of disaster response practices, systems that are effectively addressing mobility issues? And then how do we specifically look at young people in the context of climate mobility and their role and motivations?
Hi, Sarah. Maybe I can just quickly jump in on our methodology, and then we can let other speakers speak to some of the broader questions. Thank you for this question. It is definitely a good one because it is something that the field at large actually grapples with in the research approach. It is very hard in many cases to really isolate variables that are indirectly and directly influenced by climate change and the ways in which all of those variables contribute to mobility and immobility. I will say that for our approach, the survey questions looked at a variety of factors. So when people were asked about decisions to stay or leave, they were asked about their motivations, which included, I think, multiple choice and open-ended answers about why they moved. And we also looked at this from a past mobility experience, also to a forward-looking preference on moving in the future. So we were able to look at contributions to movement for all of those respondents that had previously moved, as well as those that might be moving, isolating the factors that they were considering in those decisions. I will say that, as Sarah noted, family and economic reasons were the top reported for past mobility decisions when people were responding to survey questions. However, the forward-looking questions that were geared to people that said, yes, I am considering moving in the future, about 40% of those responses saying I'm moving in the future and here are the main motivations, 40% of those respondents indicated that climate could would play a role in those future decisions. So that is roughly how our methodology sought to capture these complex motivations. And when we are talking about climate mobility and immobility, we are trying to use that to attribute it to movement where participants themselves listed it as motivated by climate.
Okay, so if I can jump into give an answer to that. We look at climate mobility and economic mobility in the terms of pushing and pulls. So mostly when it's an economic mobility, it's a pulling factor. Something is causing that person to move from where they are. They are going either for a better job, better opportunities. So there's something external that is pulling that person away. But when it comes to climate mobility, there's something that is pushing that person away. And unfortunately, we have climate mobility and we have climate immobility, in that the climate factors are pushing the person away, but they cannot move for certain economic reasons. And that's how we differentiate both of them.
Laura, do you want to speak to the youth question maybe?
Yes, I was thinking about it. So I think that we have to understand a few things around this idea. The first one is that young people also, especially if we are thinking young people in vulnerable communities, they already have their own challenge. And if we put plus climate mobility, this is another challenge from one point of view. So one of the main points is also how we can try to put this conversation around the needs from the young people. First one, recognizing first the injustice around climate there. And the second point will be how we can close this gap between what the communities or the young people needs, but also what we are offering in general. And in the practice, that can be, for example, if in the universities and these places, or the places where we are learning for, we can also start learning how to adapt and how to be resilient for climate mobility. This means, for example, and we know this practice that works very well when young people can learn from the schools and from the university practice to understand what are the vulnerables, what are the risks from the place that they are. This can be very important also for the knowledge, because we know that as young people, even if we are very exposed to social medias, to receive quality information can be very helpful also to translate or to share this information for the community that we have around. So this will be my first recommendation. And the last one will be also how we can think that in the professional ways and the ways that the young people are thinking to work in general, these solutions or this work can be very related with this challenge that we have in the country. So I mean, we know that with all this the risk, we have food insecurity. This is, of course, a very important issue. How can we put together the need that the community has with also the work that young people are doing and put that in order to respond to the crisis, but also to adapt? So I think that is a kind to put together all the pulses and know that young people are very open to help and to try new things in order to prove solutions for the communities.
Thank you, Laura. I think what we've seen on the question to disaster risk response system, disaster reduction, risk reduction systems, I think we've seen good action in the region in the context of rapid onset events such as hurricanes, cyclones, where islands have shown solidarity and taken in people displaced from neighboring islands, for example. And that has been facilitated through the free movement agreements that exist, especially among the Eastern Caribbean states under the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, but also in the CARICOM context. So there has been flexibility shown. But I think what we see also, though, and again, looking in light of the Inter-American Court advisory opinion also, is that these responses have largely remained more ad hoc, right? There's no clear policy, there's no clear guidance necessarily around, what happens to people beyond kind of evacuation when they're displaced longer term, what are rights beyond kind of the rights that are part of the free movement agreement. We've spoken with Dr. Francis around housing and land rights, things like that, that become important when people maybe stay longer term in another country. But also for internally displaced persons, right? When displacement takes longer than an evacuation period, what are their rights and how are they being addressed? So there are some gaps, I think, that we have seen from our policy analysis. But again, we're also now engaging with individual countries very much to dig deeper and to see in a national context, what are some of the key issues that could be addressed to not only be able to respond to displacement, but also to anticipate. And I think this ties with the last point around youth. Questions that I received when I was in St. Kitts and Nevis were very much also around like, how can we better be able to move across the region, have a recognition of skills and qualifications across the region. So how do you, as Laura mentioned, like have young people also be part of climate adaptation across the region, have a strategic vision of, what are the sectors that should be supporting the transition in the region, and how can young people and their mobility contribute to that project, I think is also a kind of collective project that could be advanced through regional bodies. We are at time. I would like to thank you all for listening, participating, especially our speakers for making time and sharing these important insights. I'd like to thank again our partners at the ACS for being on this journey with us and supporting this effort. And I would like to give the closing remarks to my colleague, Dr. Andrea Milan, who is the coordinator of our Climate Mobility Academy. He is leading our efforts to support the youth fellows, Laura and another cohort of 12 fellows, but also to build this climate mobility literacy campaign and sandbox format that you have been a part of today. So I'll pass the floor to Andrea for closing reflections and to give us an idea of the way forward with this new format that we are piloting here today.
Hi. Thank you very much, Sarah. And I know we're really over time, so I'll just share a few concluding words. Just I wanted to share with everybody that I thought this was an extremely interesting discussion, and it's the first of a series of webinars that the Global Center for Climate Mobility is organizing through our Climate Mobility Academy. And the idea really is to establish a global platform for collaboration, for learning, for knowledge sharing among stakeholders. So please reach out if you have anything of interest that you would like to work on with us. We have a literacy campaign to strengthen awareness on climate mobility, and we organize a number of events. So please stay in touch with us. I just want to, again, I know it's late, so I just want to conclude with a couple of important points. I would really like to invite you to remain engaged with us in two ways. In the short term, so the Climate Mobility Academy has a regional focus each quarter for the webinars we organize. This quarter, we are focusing on the Caribbean, given the launch of the Caribbean report. And the next webinar will be on September 26th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And in the context of the Climate Mobility Summit, we will focus on youth perspectives on climate mobility in the Greater Caribbean. It will be very interesting, dynamic. Please join us on September 26th. Secondly, and most importantly, in the long term, we will shift to a different region next quarter and then to other regions. But the point is we want to foster learning, exchange, and collaboration across regions and stakeholders. So when you see a social media announcement or an email about the next event that is perhaps not about the Caribbean, we do invite you to please join, and let's build bridges between the work that we do in different regions. Last but not least, I would and to remain in touch, you can see also in the chat the links shared by the colleagues. Last but not least, as also just written in the chat, my colleagues were faster than me. May we ask you, whoever feels comfortable, to turn your cameras on for just a few photos as we take a group photo. And I would just like to give you maybe 10 to 15 seconds in case you need to do a quick hair combing or just need a second to make sure you have the right background. And I would like to ask my colleagues, maybe my colleague Estela, if she would like to give us a little countdown for the photo by turning on your microphone, Estela, if that is okay.
Thank you, Andrea. All right, 1, 2, 3. One more photo. 1, 2, 3. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Estela. Wishing everybody a wonderful day. And for those of us in Europe, I see a couple of known names. Have a wonderful afternoon and evening. Thanks, everybody, for a rich discussion, and we look forward to the next webinar on the 26th.
Thank you.